Cassandra always thought that her marriage to Nick was a story of love and mutual understanding, which is not afraid of neither everyday life nor worries. They met at an exhibition of contemporary artists in Portland, where she was showing her work, and he came by mistake, mistaking the gallery for the office of a law firm. A few years later, they were already living together in a cozy house on the outskirts of the city, away from the bustle, surrounded by tall fir trees and quiet neighbors. However, there was one but that could break their idyll. Margaret. Margaret Bailey, Nick's mother, appeared in their lives as if on schedule, to the minute. She never called or warned, just appeared on the doorstep with the same expression on her face that the monks probably used to see at sunset in the desert, certain of her rightness and utterly unwavering. In the moments when Cassandra opened the door for her, she could have sworn she saw something remotely resembling contempt in Margaret's eyes. During the first few months of their marriage, Cassandra tried to be patient. She told herself that it was just a peculiarity of Margaret's character, that perhaps it was the way a mother's love was, especially for her only son. Nick, too, made no secret of his affection for his mother, but he tried to keep her at a distance, explaining that he wanted to give his and Cassandra's marriage room to grow. The more they tried, however, the denser Margaret's presence in their lives became. Every time she arrived, Cassandra felt as if she were an outsider in her own home. She tried to be a good hostess, smile politely, and even ask Margaret for cooking advice, even though she knew full well that she couldn't cook anything as well as Nikki's mother did. However, every time she was alone with her, Cassandra felt as if she was being evaluated, weighed, and found lightweight. "Your soup is a little too salty," Margaret quipped once, carefully setting aside her spoon. "You know Nick hates it when food is too salty, don't you?" A seemingly small thing, but Cassandra noticed Nick tense up slightly at those words. As the days grew shorter and Margaret's visits longer, Cassandra began to notice oddities that hadn't been apparent before. Nick tended to avoid discussing his mother and was frankly nervous when her visits stretched into hours. He could retreat to his study and close the door, saying he had a lot of work to do, though Cassandra could see him just sitting there, staring at the wall. One evening, when Nick was at work and Margaret stopped by again, briefly, to supposedly deliver homemade pies, Cassandra noticed how long her mother-in-law lingered in the living room, casting glances at the family photos on the shelf. It was as if she were peering at them under a microscope, searching for the smallest details that might confirm her opinion that Cassandra was no match for her son. Later, when Cassandra was about to clean the living room, she found one of the pictures upside down so that Nick and Cassandra's faces were no longer visible. Coincidence? Sometimes, lying in bed, Cassandra would ask Nick about his teenage years, trying to better understand his mother. Nick usually avoided answering, claiming that everything was normal and that she was just taking care of him after her divorce from his father. "She was the one who raised me, after all," he'd once said, shrugging evasively. But one night, when Cassandra was almost asleep, Nick suddenly spoke. His voice was husky and quiet. "You know, when I was a teenager, I often wanted to run away from home, but every time something stopped me." The morning after, he didn't want to discuss it anymore, but his words lingered in his heart. Margaret's visits continued to become more frequent and longer. She would come in without knocking, sit down on the sofa, and start talking about the good old days when Nick was a boy. Her stories, at first glance, seemed perfectly innocent, but there were moments that Cassandra was alarmed by. "Do you remember when you and I got stuck on the country road on a rainy evening?" Margaret asked her son one day, and Cassandra couldn't help but notice the way Nick rose abruptly from his seat, as if remembering something extremely unpleasant. One day, when Margaret showed up unannounced again, claiming to have come just to say hello, Cassandra noticed that her mother-in-law had been in the house longer than usual. She left her in the living room with a cup of tea and went to the studio on the second floor to continue working on a new painting. Half an hour later, coming into the kitchen, she found Margaret standing in front of the window in the hallway, holding an old photograph of Nick. The expression on her face was strange, almost pained. "You often leave personal items in plain sight, dear," Margaret commented, noticing Cassandra. "It can lead to someone thinking they don't belong to you." Cassandra felt something cold run down her back. One particularly memorable moment occurred during the weekend dinner, when Margaret announced that she had decided to buy a house in Portland. "I'll be able to visit you more often now, Nikki," she added, turning her head slightly toward Cassandra. Nick, who at this point had nearly dropped his fork a couple times, jumped up from the table and went into the study, leaving the women alone. Cassandra felt something like relief. Perhaps buying a house would distract Margaret and give her and Nick a break. But her hopes were dashed when she added, "You know I'll always be there to support my boy." That evening, as Cassandra was about to go to bed, Margaret found herself back at their house, even though all the guests had long since departed. She stood on the threshold of the bedroom, as if waiting for something. Nick looked confused and tired, and Cassandra couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret was becoming too much. Every morning at the Bailey house started the same way. Nick would leave for work around 7, leaving an empty cup and a crumpled newspaper on the kitchen table. Cassandra would come down to the kitchen a little later, when the house already seemed empty and quiet. She loved this moment when she could pour herself a cup of coffee and enjoy the silence, which had yet to be broken by calls from Nick's clients or Margaret's unexpected visit. These mornings were her time. She would sit down in her little work nook and pick up her paintbrush, letting her thoughts flow freely. But in recent months, even this activity had ceased to bring her peace. Sometimes it seemed to her that behind every stroke there was something hidden and obscure that prevented her from concentrating on her work. At such times, she threw away her brush and walked away, leaving the canvases unfinished. Margaret's presence was felt in their home even when she wasn't around. Sometimes Cassandra found odd little things, an old handkerchief on a chair, a forgotten bottle of perfume in the bathroom, as if her mother-in-law had simply left traces of her presence. At one point, Cassandra even began to think that Margaret did it on purpose, as if she wanted to emphasize her influence. It seemed that whenever she and Nick tried to arrange life their own way, Margaret somehow inserted her own rules. One day, Cassandra discovered that there was a new soap dish in the bathroom, neat, porcelain, with ornate patterns. She knew for a fact it wasn't hers to buy. Nick wouldn't bother with such trivialities either. When she asked him about it, he shrugged. "My mom must have left it. No need to worry." Those words pissed her off more than she would have liked. Worry? Yes, she wanted to say much more than just worry. Margaret seemed to be deliberately intruding into their lives, adding her family rituals, as if to remind Cassandra that she was only a guest here. Over the weekend, when Nick decided to stay home and relax, Margaret showed up unexpectedly with a pie. "I thought you might enjoy it," she announced, bringing the hot aroma of baked goods and her invariable comments on everything in sight into the house. Cassandra stood in the kitchen chopping salad and listened to her mother-in-law discuss with her son how cozy their old house had been. "Remember, Nikki, how we used to decorate it every fall? It's certainly nice in this new house, but still not the same." Cassandra tried to pretend not to notice this obvious play on nostalgia, but once she heard Margaret speak of the old house, where everything was under her care, she barely restrained herself from throwing the knife on the table. It was clear that Margaret still believed that her son belonged to her, and everyone else were temporary guests in his life. Over the next few days, Cassandra noticed her mother-in-law intruding more and more into their routine. She came over whenever she wanted, opening the refrigerator as if it were her own, rearranging things in the closets. Nick didn't antagonize. He was too busy with work and preferred to avoid conflict, so he often simply remained silent when Cassandra started talking about her mother. Sometimes he would say, "It's just Mom. She's not doing anything wrong." But to Cassandra, it wasn't just Mom. It was a constant reminder that her home would never be hers alone. On another Saturday night, as she and Nick sat in the kitchen, Margaret stopped by again. "For a little while. I brought soup. I know you're not much of a cook, Cassandra," she said with a look on her face as if it was the most innocent joke. Cassandra could barely resist responding with sarcasm, but instead just thanked her, trying not to show her irritation. At dinner, Margaret sat across the table and continued to talk about the good old days, which Cassandra was getting tired of. For a moment, Cassandra found herself envying Nick for his ability to shut down and withdraw into himself. He sat there, staring at his phone, pretending to be doing something important, while she had to listen to Margaret remind them both over and over again that she was the true mistress of the house. When dinner was over, Cassandra decided to wash the dishes to provide some distraction. The smell of pie still lingered in the kitchen, and she wiped the table with a machine. Suddenly, her gaze fell on a small drawing on the knife rack. It was some ridiculous flower that resembled a daisy. "Do you remember, Nick, how I taught you to draw flowers like that?" Margaret's voice suddenly sounded. Nick shook his head and walked off into the living room without even answering. Cassandra wasn't about to continue this nostalgic tirade either. She knew that Margaret was deliberately inserting herself into their daily routines, taking small but meaningful steps to remind them who was really important in this family. The situation reached absurdity when Cassandra discovered that Margaret had rehung their wedding photos, leaving one from the wedding reception and adding an old picture of Nick as a child. "He was so cute," her mother-in-law commented when she saw Cassandra's reaction. "Isn't it wonderful how some things stay the same?" It was that moment when Cassandra realized that Margaret's presence in their lives was not just an annoyance, but something far more threatening. It was a persistent ghost of the past that didn't want to let go of Nick. She felt that the house was no longer their place together. It had become a battleground where every little thing could be an excuse for more passive-aggressive outbursts. One day, while packing up the laundry room, Cassandra found a small note from Margaret in Nick's pocket. "Don't forget Sunday dinner." It was written in neat handwriting. It wouldn't have aroused her suspicions if it hadn't been for the last sentence. "We can always talk like we used to in private." Margaret had always been adept at pressuring those around her, doing it so discreetly that her words and actions at first seemed casual, even caring. Cassandra, however, was beginning to realize that such care had a price, and it was Nick who was paying for it. Every day Margaret became more and more obsessive. She called Nick 3 or 4 times a day with questions such as, "Have you eaten?" Or, "Did you remember to take your vitamins?" Or, "Why isn't Cassandra answering my messages?" Her voice on the phone was both calm and insistent, a note of rebuke even when she was just asking how her day was going. Nick answered her one-word answers, but you could see how annoyed he was. He was staying at the office more and more often, preferring to work late rather than return home, where his wife and mother were waiting for him like rivals. For Cassandra, this was a real challenge. It seemed Margaret was deliberately trying to torment her, slipping in subtle remarks about how Nick used to always like chicken and vegetables, even though Cassandra had cooked something else, or that he looked healthier when I was still looking after him. Every time she heard those words, she had to restrain herself from exploding. Nick tried not to interfere, but his silence only added fuel to the fire. One evening, when Cassandra returned home from the gallery, she noticed Margaret sitting on the couch, rereading something. As she came closer, Cassandra saw that it was old letters. "Just sorting things out here," her mother-in-law said with a look as if she had every right to go through their personal belongings. Cassandra could barely resist snatching the papers out of her hands. Later, when Margaret left, Cassandra decided to see what the letters were. Among the piles of old documents and family photos, she found several sheets written in Margaret's hand. The style of the writing was strange, almost intimate, and what should have been motherly advice sounded more like a letter to a lover. "You know I will always be there for you," she wrote. Or, "Nikki, don't let anyone come between us." These lines were like tightening a noose around Cassandra's neck. She realized that her husband's mother saw her not just as a rival, but as a threat to her sick affection. Meanwhile, Nick became increasingly withdrawn. He came home tired, went straight to the study, and answered Cassandra's questions in a slurred manner. It seemed that their marriage was coming apart, and the more Margaret pressed her son, the more he drifted away from Cassandra. One night at dinner, when Margaret was once again discreetly discussing the importance of remembering her responsibilities to her family, Cassandra couldn't take it anymore. "Nick and I are adults, and can decide for ourselves what is important to us." She didn't expect Nick to silently get up and walk away, leaving her alone with her mother-in-law. "You'll never understand what it means to be a mother, Cassandra," Margaret said in an icy tone that sent shivers down her spine. "Nick was mine before he was yours." After that evening, Nick came home even less often. Cassandra didn't know how to help him, and he seemed to avoid her gaze. She decided to look again at the letters she had found earlier. She was alarmed not only by the content, but also by the fact that they were dated from when Nick was a teenager. One of the letters made her particularly uneasy. In it, Margaret wrote about how she missed the nights when they were alone in the house, and how no one could understand what they meant to each other. That evening proved particularly difficult for Cassandra. Her feelings of anxiety and resentment toward Margaret grew stronger with every word she read, but she didn't know how to talk to Nick about it. What could she say? "Honey, I think your mother loves you somehow." Wrong? It sounded crazy even to herself. Another memorable incident happened at the supermarket she and Nick had gone to together. There they met Margaret, who, in her words, happened to be in the store. When she saw her son and his wife, as if offhand, she approached and began asking why they hadn't come to her house for dinner last Sunday. "Nicky, you know how much I miss our evenings together. Remember when we used to make your favorite pie?" she asked, as if trying to make him nostalgic. Nick smiled uncertainly and turned away to the grocery shelves. But later, when he and Cassandra were in the car, he suddenly announced that he planned to go to his mother's house the following weekend to just talk. Cassandra, trying not to show disappointment, only nodded. She couldn't help but feel that Margaret was purposefully destroying their marriage, but how could she prove it to Nick if he didn't want to see it? She decided to make copies of those letters and hid them to show her husband on occasion. The tension in the house grew, and one day there was a real scene. Margaret came to the house unannounced while Cassandra was in the studio. She overheard their conversation as she came down the stairs. Margaret's voice was louder than usual, with a clear rebuke in it. "She's just using you, Nicky. You're blind if you can't see that," she stated with such certainty as if she were stating an immutable truth. As Cassandra entered the room, Margaret turned to her, and with an expression full of grim determination on her face said, "You are taking the man I love from me, and I will not let you destroy my family." There seemed to be something much deeper in those words than mere maternal jealousy. Nick stood beside her, clenching his teeth, but not saying a word in defense of his wife. It was the moment Cassandra realized that she was fighting not just an obsessive mother-in-law, but something far more frightening. Later, when Margaret had already left and Cassandra was cleaning the kitchen, Nick entered the room with a tired look. "I can't take it anymore," he said with his head down. Cassandra approached him, but he pulled away as if even her touch hurt. "Maybe we should live apart for a while," he suggested, trying not to meet her gaze. The words came out of the blue. Cassandra realized she was losing this fight. When Margaret announced that she would be staying with them just for a few days, Cassandra knew it would be more than just a few nights on a cot in the guest room. Nick, upon hearing of her plans, tried to object, but her mother was adamant, stating that she needed a break from the big city and to spend time with her son, whom she was seeing less and less of. Nick sighed, muttered something like "okay," and disappeared into his office, leaving Cassandra to deal with the consequences. The first night went relatively smoothly, except for Margaret reminding everyone again at dinner about her favorite lasagna recipe and how Nick always ate it with such gusto. Cassandra couldn't resist a little cynicism, noting that on Nick's diet, lasagna had long been on the forbidden list. This irritated Margaret, but she did her best to hide her displeasure behind a strained smile. On the second day of Margaret's stay, Cassandra began to notice oddities that no longer seemed random. A couple of personal items she kept in her nightstand drawer ended up on the living room table. Someone had clearly opened her makeup bag and pulled lipstick out of there. Her favorite dress hanging in the closet had traces of someone else's perfume on it, which smelled retro, the very same perfume that had always accompanied Margaret. Cassandra was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, feeling the ground beneath her feet receding. Nick, watching what was happening, was leaving the house more and more often. He stayed late at work, avoided talking, and looked tired all the time. When Cassandra once again tried to discuss his mother with him, he only waved it off. "It's just for a couple days," he said one day without taking his eyes off the computer screen. "We'll get over it." But Cassandra wasn't so sure anymore. That same evening, as she walked past the office where Margaret and Nick were talking, she heard scraps of phrases. "You don't understand anything, Mom," Nick said. and she could hear the weariness mixed with despair in his voice. "At least give me some space." His mother's reply was almost affectionate, but with a note of threat. "I'm just looking out for you, Nikki. You're too far gone if you think I can leave you alone." The climax occurred on Friday night. Margaret decided to prepare a family dinner, insisting that everyone should be together. When Cassandra got home, the smell of roasting meat and garlic filled the house, but instead of coziness, an unsettling feeling came over her. She walked into the kitchen and saw Margaret confidently handling the pots and pans as if it were her own home. "Have you decided to become part of the family, dear?" Margaret asked sarcastically, not taking her eyes off the cooking. Cassandra walked past silently, trying to contain herself. She went upstairs to the bedroom to change, but when she opened the closet, she found an old teddy bear toy on her bed, a bear that Nick had long ago lost, according to him. Now the bear lay with a clear expression of annoying contempt in its plastic eyes, as if it were part of a conspiracy. By the time Cassandra returned to the kitchen, dinner was ready, and Nick was sitting at the table, staring morosely at his plate. Margaret had served everything with meticulous care, placing each bite on the platter as if on display. But when Cassandra joined them, something inside her snapped. "Why don't you just leave, Margaret?" she blurted out, unable to hold back any longer. "We can take care of ourselves. We don't need you meddling in our lives every time you want to." There was silence for a moment, and then Nick's voice came out. "Cassandra, stop it," he whispered, barely lifting his eyes from his plate. "You don't understand." "No, you don't understand," she replied sharply. "She controls you like a puppet on a string, and you let her do it." Margaret stood up and threw her napkin on the table, her face marble and impassive. "You're just jealous that Nick loves his mother," she declared icily. "But you'll never understand what true connection means." Cassandra took a step back, feeling short of breath. She couldn't believe Margaret had said it out loud, but it was those very words that made Nick lose his temper. "Enough!" he shouted, getting up from his seat. "I'm not going to listen to this anymore. I can't live in the past anymore, Mom." Nick grabbed his jacket and walked out of the house, slamming the door loudly. Cassandra was left standing in the kitchen, unable to say a word. Margaret threw her a look of contempt and left the house as well, saying that she could use a walk right now. Several hours passed. Cassandra couldn't calm down, thrashing around the house, not knowing where to go. When Nick finally returned, he looked haggard and devastated. He walked past her without a word and locked himself in his office. Cassandra decided she needed to talk, to figure things out, to finally understand what was behind this murky family history. She approached the office and, knocking, stepped inside. Nick was sitting at the desk, tucked into his hands. He lifted his head, and his gaze was full of pain. "I tried to run away when I was 16, he said suddenly. "Back then, I thought I could live with a friend. His parents were okay with it. But my mom found me. She threatened me, promised that if I left, she would feel so bad that she wouldn't be able to live anymore. I couldn't leave her then." "But Nick, you're an adult now. You don't have to stay under her control." Cassandra tried to convince him. "You don't understand," he interrupted her. She had this special affection. It wasn't just maternal love. I've tried to forget it, but I can't." His words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Cassandra felt something inside her shatter. The next morning, Cassandra didn't hear the familiar sounds that came from Nick's office. She went to the door and knocked, but there was no answer. The door was locked, and when she managed to open it, she saw Nick lying on the floor, showing no signs of life. The doctor who arrived on the call could not immediately determine the cause of death. It looked like an accident, but Cassandra realized that was just the tip of the iceberg. When the detectives arrived at the Bailey home, the first thing that caught their eye was the tense atmosphere, as if every object and even the walls had absorbed the tragedy. Margaret greeted them with a face full of grief. Portraying the image of a deeply distraught mother, Cassandra sat in the kitchen looking both exhausted and confused. Her eyes read incomprehension, as if she was still trying to wake up from a bad dream. Senior Detective George Collins, a man with a weathered face and a tired look, immediately sensed that there were many hidden details in this family. He was to unravel threads that were far more intertwined than might at first appear. Margaret had spoken of her son with such intensity that it seemed a little excessive, but of course, her position allowed her to express her emotions to the fullest. She claimed to have found Nick in the morning when he didn't answer her knock. He always worked late, so I wasn't worried at first, but when he didn't show up for breakfast, I decided to check. Her voice shook, but not too much. Collins noted this to himself. Cassandra immediately fell under suspicion. The detectives knew there had been conflicts between the couple, and while there was no evidence of violence or overt threats, there were still fights at the Bailey home on a regular basis, as neighbors had reported. But Collins noticed something odd about Margaret's behavior. She was constantly inserting her own comments, interrupting Cassandra, as if she were trying to control the flow of the conversation. Cassandra didn't realize that Nick was more than just a husband to her. He was everything to me, Margaret stated, emphasizing her words in a tone as if accusing Cassandra of not knowing all the true values of their family. Collins gave her a long look and made a note in his notebook. When the questioning turned to Cassandra, her accounts of the last few days were chaotic. She mentioned oddities with things in the house, pressure from Margaret, and even how her mother-in-law was constantly meddling in their personal life. But the detectives were skeptical of what she said, as much of it could have been taken as complaints by the wife against her husband's mother. Only one statement caught their attention. Cassandra mentioned that Margaret was often alone with Nick in his office and didn't come out immediately. She couldn't explain exactly what it was that brought them together, but it clearly wasn't simple business talk. The next day, the detectives decided to conduct a more detailed inspection of the house. Nick's office, where the body had been found, attracted particular attention. On the desk was a container of insomnia pills he had been taking. A closer look revealed that the lid was not closed properly. The marks on it indicated frequent opening. The pills themselves also looked uneven. Some of them were slightly lighter in color than the others. This immediately aroused suspicion, and the detectives sent them for analysis. Margaret was present during the search and was visibly nervous as the detectives went through her son's things. Her gaze darted around the room as if she was looking for something she didn't want to be found. Collins noticed this and made another note in his notebook. The results of the examination of the pills confirmed their suspicions. One of them contained a powerful drug that Nick could not take as prescribed. That meant that someone had substituted part of his medication. But even stranger was the fact that Margaret's fingerprints were found on the container, not only on the lid, but also on the vial itself. The detective's next step was obvious: a conversation with the pharmacist who had once served the Bailey family. There, they discovered that the prescription for the drug they found had been written in Margaret's name several years ago. Collins recalled that Margaret had claimed as if she hadn't touched her son's medication at all because it was his own business. But now the detectives realized that her words were at odds with the facts. The more they delved into the details, the more disturbing aspects of the Bailey family's past opened up to them. While talking to Nick's friends, detectives learned that he had tried to leave home several times as a teenager. One of those attempts included an overnight escape to a friend's house whose parents wanted to host Nick, but he returned home after Margaret's visit. The reasons for the return were unclear, but Nick's acquaintances remembered that his condition changed afterward. He became withdrawn and avoided talking about his family. Particularly revealing was a conversation with an old family friend who happened to mention the strange relationship between Margaret and Nick. He said he had seen them in moments when they were too close for just mother and son. "I always thought it was just her being overprotective of him," he admitted, but then added, "although sometimes I thought it was more than that." Cassandra slowly began to realize that her suspicions about the abnormality of Nick's relationship with his mother were not unfounded. Margaret, on the other hand, continued to play the role of the grief-stricken mother, but Collins began to notice that her behavior changed, depending on Cassandra's presence. There was a flicker of something resembling satisfaction in her gaze when Cassandra was under pressure. At one of the regular interrogations, Cassandra told the detectives about the letters they had found that Margaret had written to Nick when he was a teenager. Detectives had requested these letters and found strange expressions not typical of the average mother. "Only you can understand me," or "we will always be together, no matter what." These phrases seemed particularly disturbing against the background of what the detectives now knew about Nick's past. Further searching led to a discovery that finally confirmed their suspicions. In a garbage can outside the house, the detectives found a thin cord, cut at both ends, that had clearly been used recently. Margaret's handprints were found on it. It might have been just a strange find if it hadn't been for one but. The cord was the perfect length for the theory that it had been used to lock the lock from the inside. As the detectives began to narrow down the suspects, the situation grew murkier by the day. Everything pointed to Margaret, though she tried to play the grief-stricken mother incapable of harming her own son. But the evidence was coming together. Pills laced with sleeping pills, traces of the cord used to lock the door, and strange letters that looked more and more like love confessions than motherly instructions. Margaret was called in for another interrogation, where Detective Collins decided to press her into the role of victim. He began by mentioning those very letters. At first, Margaret held her confidence, but when the detective went into the details of the content, "We'll always be together no matter what. You're the only one who understands me." Her face twisted slightly, as if someone had suddenly slapped her. "It's just an expression of a mother's love." She started to justify herself, but her voice began to tremble. "Nick has always been a sensitive boy, and I've tried to be supportive." Collins leaned closer to her, a cold smile on his face. "You knew Nick was going to leave, didn't you?" he asked quietly, as if by accident. Margaret froze. She clearly hadn't expected such a direct question, and something akin to fear flashed in her gaze. "He was too weak to realize what he needed," she whispered. "I was protecting him from himself." "Protecting you?" Collins raised an eyebrow sarcastically. "Or maybe you were just trying to hold him back. When he decided to cut all ties again, you went to extreme measures?" Margaret pressed her lips together and took a deep breath. Her voice shook. "He couldn't do that again. I wouldn't let it happen." Collins and his colleagues sensed that the true motives were about to be revealed. They pressed harder, picking up on her unstable state, her willingness to justify everything that had been done. "So you did replace his pills," the detective said, keeping his gaze on her. "And then you used the cord to lock the door from the inside, all so that no one would know about your special relationship with your son." Margaret suddenly laughed. It was a nervous, hysterical laugh that sounded like a sign of desperation. "Nick was mine," she said, finally calming down and looking into Collins's eyes with an eerie calm. "Only mine. He always came back to me no matter how strong and independent he tried to appear. But Cassandra, she was destroying our connection. She just couldn't understand. Nick had belonged to me since birth, and I wouldn't let her take him away from me." Margaret's confession was frank enough for the detectives to realize this wasn't just a story of maternal love turned obsession. It was something darker than they had realized. They recorded her words and informed Cassandra of the results of the investigation. When Cassandra heard of her mother-in-law's confession, her first reaction was a mixture of horror and relief. Horror, because it was even worse than she could have imagined. Relief because now her suspicions were confirmed, and she no longer felt insane. Margaret was arrested, but even in prison she continued to say that her love for her son was true and eternal. It didn't bother her that it looked perverted and unnatural to everyone else. After her mother-in-law's arrest, Cassandra was left alone in an empty house. It no longer seemed like a cozy and safe place, more like a place where ghosts of the past could be stumbled upon around every corner. She tried to go back to her work, to paint again, but it was as if the brushes didn't want to fit in her hand and the canvases remained empty. She moved in with friends for a few weeks, leaving the house locked up and trying to avoid any unnecessary conversations about what had happened. Her life became an attempt to find meaning amidst the wreckage. She pondered how Margaret could have so distorted her feelings for her son, and how Nick might have spent a long time trying to escape from something that was too horrible to talk about. At times it seemed to her that she herself was but an accidental victim of a family nightmare that had arisen long before her time. One day, when Cassandra finally decided to go back into the house to get her things, she came across an old photograph of Nick that was in a desk drawer in the study. The picture was of a young Nick, about 16 years old, with a shy smile on his face. She couldn't help but notice the sadness mixed with tenderness in his eyes. In that moment, Cassandra realized that Nick had spent his entire life trying to free himself from whatever was holding him back, but he had never been able to find his way to freedom. In the months that followed, Cassandra found support at an emotional abuse support group. There, she met people who had experienced different tragedies, and as she listened to their stories, she began to realize that her experience, though unusual, was not unique. This allowed her to slowly let go of her pain, share her experiences, and learn to live again. Despite her attempts to get her life back on track, the shadows of the past continued to haunt her. Sometimes she found herself turning around, as if expecting to see Margaret around the corner, or waking in the night, unable to shake off the worry that the bedroom door might suddenly open. One day, as Cassandra was walking down the street downtown, she suddenly heard a familiar scent, the same retro perfume Margaret always smelled like. It was a strange feeling, a mixture of panic and something like longing. She turned around, but of course no one was around. She laughed, realizing how much her mind had grown accustomed to the threat, but there was still bitterness inside. Of course, her life would never be the same again. Cassandra understood that and didn't try to idealize the future. She knew that she would have a long time to learn to deal with the consequences of everything that had happened. But despite everything Margaret had tried to destroy, she still had the strength to move on.